Good evening and welcome to I can't believe I'm saying this, another actual webinar about Brexit. I'm going to do very quickly just to get the admin out of the way because I want to go on with that sentence a little bit further. For all of you that are listening in, I normally, when I do these things, trying to be as interactive as possible. I say very clearly that I don't know all the answers and I don't think I should. I would much prefer to be sitting here and having a discussion about this and debating about how you trade it and what you do with it and how that goes through your thinking. So if you do have a question or you have a suggestion or a thought process, please in the questions box, just fire away. I will actually stop myself and read it out and make sure that we continue to make sure that we're all involved with this going forward. Other thing, as always, please remember that this is completely general in nature. Please have a very good quick read through of the disclaimer on screen. As I said many times before, I'm a contractor for FP Markets. I don't work for them, and therefore I'm a little bit different again. And therefore, everything that we discuss tonight is completely general in nature. None of it's personal advice at all. And particularly with what's going on right now, the volatility that's going on because of this, and I'll talk about the idiosyncratic version of the euro sterling in a minute. Obviously, that there will be disappointment. I think that needs to be clear, and we'll go through that quite strongly in a minute. But just going back to here, never underestimate how good a politician is to a trader, because my word, and I don't normally sort of slightly swear when I do these things, but what a cock up this has actually now become. We are staring down the barrel in 2.5 weeks' time that not only will Brexit happen with a crash out scenario, but you could actually be seeing almost the scorched earth scenario going on. We know the UK and the Europeans are going through some pretty horrible scenarios with COVID, and what is being currently war gamed with regards to a no deal being done and a pretty hard no deal being done at the same time, particularly by Michael Gove, who is basically the minister in charge of Brexit completely now, is just absolute scorched earth, and the ability to get essentials into particularly the UK looks very, very difficult indeed, particularly considering things like medicines. Also, there's actual certain chemicals needed to clean London's water service so they can actually sort of function on a fairly reasonable basis. All of that kind of stuff that comes from Germany, they look like having to somehow fly it in from other places, all of that in between. So never underestimate how good politicians can be to our world in trading, because it has created a level of volatility that I don't think we were expecting with after this year was going to come from politics. It was more likely to come from a vaccine. And we discussed that with the US presidential election. And clearly the vaccine has been a positive volatility mover to the upside. And I'll come to that in a minute as well. But who would have thought we'd be sitting here and basically staring down the barrel of a Brexit that is going to be hard. It's going to be a very, very strong finish to that is. Now, why is that? And for those of you who were here on my first one and going through this, nothing's actually really changed in terms of the big sticking points. In fact, they've probably, if anything, become more defined. And some would even argue they're getting further away from where they were even as little as 2 weeks ago, which is just amazing. So it's fisheries, judicial oversight, and the level playing field. Now, with the level playing field, that's something I'll come to at the end, because that third point is the biggest issue and will basically be the issue that you can probably look at from a trading perspective. How they treat that, particularly the Europeans, and how they look at it. Fisheries and judicial oversight. I'm going to take the second one because that, from what's being mentioned over the weekend, and the fact that, as I said here, the title of this is a very far away. That is Boris Johnson's words to the max, in the fact that at the moment he believes there's only a 20% chance that we will get some form of deal by the 31st of December. And the first one that looks like being somehow agreed upon is judicial oversight. One of the biggest reasons Brexit happened, one of the biggest Brexiteer issues was judicial oversight, was the fact that, particularly if you have been to the UK, or from the UK, or understand how the UK works, they are incredibly proud of the Westminster system, and they're very, very proud of common law. Incredibly proud. We here in Australia know common law very well. It's what we have most of our legal systems based off, and our legal principles. It's the whole idea of you are innocent to proven guilty, etc., etc. It also means that your ability to choose your court settings, your ability to choose your legal settings, etc., all done under that system, whereas the EU is mainly done under a civil system, and it's different. But the other issue that Brexiteers had is that they can have their Supreme Court do what they need to, rule on certain things, whatever that may be, whether it's through criminal, corporate, administration law, it doesn't matter. It was all done up to the Supreme Court, but under the rules of the EU treaty membership, technically Brussels could come in over the top and actually overrule the UK Supreme Court. Now that was a big, big issue. Now judicial oversight, they're starting to get to a point where that can actually be appeased for the Brexiteers, where the judicial oversight of basically the majority of things will be done in the UK without any influence from the EU. There are certain trade judicial oversights that are a little bit sticky, and that sort of it does slightly filter into the level playing field rule, but I'll come to that later. But judicial oversight is basically being sort of brought back to a level where the UK will have pretty much straight autonomy with that, and that from the UK perspective is why one of the biggest things around Brexit and Brexit happening was to have that ability to choose, inverted commas, their own destiny, and have their own legal frameworks that choose their own destiny. I think as we discussed last time at the start of the month, the other reason for that scenario is the UK actually, inverted commas, exports law to the world. So discussing that again a bit further, if you had an international trade dispute, for instance, let's just for argument's sake say Australia was having a trade dispute with New Zealand, we couldn't agree on what system or legal framework to use, we can actually go to the UK and have it settled there. And they do a very, very good trade in that kind of legal space. So it's not surprising that particularly Downing Street has been very strong on the idea of judicial oversight is going to be the point going forward, and why Brexiteers particularly were quite strong on it. So fisheries. This is actually quite interesting because it looked like when the last time we did this 2 weeks ago, they were getting close to finding some form of deal. The thing that's happened particularly in the last 5 days, is they've actually got further away from where they are, particularly when over the weekend, and again, both sides of politics in the UK have actually slightly condemned this, we actually saw 4 naval vessels from the UK basically patrolling the English Channel. So the current suggestion last week from Boris Johnson was that he would allow a 3-year transmission period for particularly French and Dutch trawlers to fish in British waters, and starting from next year as sort of like a transition period. It was vehemently rejected, particularly by Mike Rutte, who is the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. They have been freely fishing, particularly the North Sea, for basically as far as time can remember, even before the EU became what it is, and the UK and the Netherlands became part of the one single market, etc., etc. And they are ropeable by this. There is no doubt about that. The Dutch particularly see this as quite an affront to their freedoms, and in an area that they have been fishing, they would argue, for almost a millennia. The French are also not impressed with it, particularly Emmanuel Macron. He is making it very clear that French fisheries should be free to move around, particularly the waters in the Atlantic, and also the ability to move through the Channel. So it's actually interesting that they're getting further away. And part of it comes down to that second dot point. It's the differences over free and fair competition. Access to those markets, to those fishing waters. Where does the borders get drawn, inverted commas? Because some would argue that actual waters aren't bordered. They're international waters, period. You can look at that across the world. It's not just something that's going on between 2 NATO allies that are clearly having a bit of a falling out. So it's got far-reaching ramifications. But what is more concerning by this is that they are actually further away now than where they were. And the fact that the EU rejected that proposal shows that they've got more to lose than probably we realised, and that particularly the Dutch and the French may play hardball here in terms of how they work, and therefore the worst scenario there would be something along the lines of actually seeing naval vessels go further. So that's the one to watch. And actually, as I speak this morning, just having a look, I've been watching the Brexit alerts quite closely. You have actually seen at the moment the UK's junior finance minister saying that fundamental issues remain the same. and that at the moment fisheries is one of the biggest blocks that the EU, in his words, are putting up to how they go forward. So that's certainly one to watch, and may explain why this morning we've just seen the pound go negative after starting the day in the positive. But we'll come to the trading a little bit later. Then going the extra mile. So yesterday, if you didn't see it, we did actually see Michael Brenner, who is the European Union chief Brexit negotiator, who basically said that they will extend the deadlines with regards to getting some form of deal done rather than it being basically Sunday. They're giving it an extra 48, 72, or however many hours they need to do it. And personally, I don't think you should be putting a time frame on it. It's also meant that the European Parliament has decided to see a wait and see approach. They're not basically calling themselves in yet. They will when something happens, if it happens, inverted commas. And on the other side, you'll also see Westminster now have allowed themselves the ability to sit on Christmas Eve and also on Boxing Day, if necessary, to vote this through. So that's where that extra mile comes from. It's what, again, Boris Johnson is using in his language to try and push forward. But the level playing field is the one that is probably almost non-negotiable from both sides, yet it needs to be worked out and compromised for a deal to happen. And for those of you that were here on the first one, you'd understand the level playing field, as you would know, is that basically the EU wants all 27 members to have basically the same scenarios applied to them. Now, again, getting back to the negotiations, because I think this is core, and particularly with what's happened in trading in the last 5 days, it is around the release of information from those negotiations, particularly behind closed door. There is very much confirmed reports and pretty much a certainty, actually, that what we know Boris Johnson offered Ursula von der Leyen was that they would pay some tariffs up front to basically alleviate what the UK will do, which is they will break the level playing field rule. There's no doubt about that. They want to go and do trade deals with other nations. They want to also look at providing free trade agreements with places like Australia. They also want to offer trade negotiations with nations that the EU doesn't want to do that with, trading of freer trading of goods. Taking tariffs off things like Australian and New Zealand wines is another good example of what they're talking about here, because the reason you explain those, agricultural products are actually the biggest problem here. The EU does subsidise its farmers quite strongly. They offer free trade agreements inside themselves for agriculture, and nations outside of it tend to have a tariff of some description. The UK would allow itself and would want to offer FTAs to agriculture around the world. And that's where this level playing field rule really gets quite tricky. So the UK, according to what we've heard, is that Boris Johnson offered to pay some tariffs up front to remove the ratchet clause. And that is the one that was met with a very, very stony response. Now, what we've been seeing, particularly in the last 24 hours, is that Emmanuel Macron and also Angela Merkel, who are probably the biggest players in this, have started moving in the background saying that no, we want to have some form of deal and we need to get this through. And it suggests that they're willing to probably drop the tariffs that come that when you immediately breach it. It may actually be a negotiated agreement that if you break the level playing field, Britain, we will do a negotiated levy for what that might be. Now, again, that is pure speculation, what I've just chosen to use in terms of my wording, but that's the rumors that we're getting with regards to what's happening now. And again, that's what I'd say it is rumors, it's innuendo, and it's certainly playing out that way. It's also playing out in terms of what you're seeing with movements in markets. Because that's how this is all coming about. It is moving the pound particularly, and euro sterling particularly, with all of this innuendo that's coming out and moving it quite quickly, which is certainly something that it's going to probably get even more extraordinary over this week, considering that realistically, if there's nothing done by even if I'm honest, by Sunday. I think that's even an extended period again. If there's nothing by Sunday, you just can't see it happening. And as I said, going back to the start with what Boris Johnson said on the weekend, he sees a 20% chance of a deal being done. The most likely scenario in his eyes is a no Brexit free trade agreement. And the UK and the EU will go their separate ways, with basically the World Trade Organization as the base for how they're going to interact. Now, why I start there is, what does that mean? I know, looking at how this is, and again, these points are speculation again, and why I've actually put that headline, the Battle for Trafalgar 2.0, is that we actually know that Michael Gove has been sitting down with his Operation XO, going through, because he's like Boris Johnson. He comes from a background in marketing. He comes from a background in journalism, and what he apparently has been doing is actually writing what would be the worst case headlines that they could actually present. And one of them he wrote would be the Battle of Trafalgar, and that is that fisheries issue. Actually, having the UK Navy having to patrol the English Channel and the North Sea to keep its NATO ally, as I said before, out of its own fishing waters. It would be extraordinary. It would be probably one of the worst scorched earth scenarios that could happen, to actually see a trade dispute, what would almost be moving into an actual conflict, an armed conflict. And look, it won't happen. I understand that, but that's how far they're going on this. That's what's so staggering around it, and why, particularly in the last 5 days, as we've seen more and more releases from cabinets of both sides of the channel, and what they're moving towards and how they're operating, it's just astounding to think that the stubbornness, the political will to actually get something done, or the political will, inverted commas, on the other side, to actually put up obstacles to basically make nationalism more important than actually getting this done. And some would point at the UK that this is their fault. They've decided to do this, and away they go. But in saying that, the fact that you have seen an inability over what is now pretty much bang on 4.5 years since this happened, to still be at this point is just absolutely staggering. Um, as I said at the start of this talk, the UK is looking to fly in emergency supplies, particularly medicines, at a time when COVID is raging. We know the UK became the first country on the planet to start using the Pfizer COVID vaccine, which hopefully will actually start to take effect, and start to slow down their infection rate, sort of probably March, April next year. But in saying that, it's what happens post the 31st of December. And that's what this is. This is, at the moment, I know it might not be as draconian as what I've got on screen, or as, you know, horrendous as what I've got on screen. These are things that they are planning for, particularly the transport through the tunnel and the delays that that's going to cause. The ability to actually process the amount of goods that move between the UK and the EU every day, now that they actually have to go through border checks, is going to be astounding. A logistical nightmare to start with, let alone what tariffs are on what, how much the cost of things are now going to be. Do they have to place a 10% tariff on XYZ? It's because it's no longer a free trade between the two parts. All of that is there. We know that there's also very clear a lot of businesses on both sides of the channel that are looking to Norway, and using Norway as a way through it. Uh, how this, particularly considering that this is happening in winter, particularly this is happening during the height of the third wave of COVID, it could not become worse. And why I finish on that before I get off all of the ramble that I'm doing here with regards to actual all the backstory, etc., is that all this says to me, from a trader's point of view, is volatility. All this says to me is that clearly there is going to be some really, really hard lessons that come out of this. There's going to be inaction. There will be finger pointing and blame. And in the end, let's also point it out, not beat around the bush, there will be suffering from this. There is clear there will be things in Europe and in the UK that they should be able to get without even blinking, that they won't be able to have on their shelves in their supermarkets or in their pharmacies or what have you, because of what is going on with the likelihood of this happening. But what is interesting, in the last week, basically, and this chart actually came out yesterday, so this is true, is that we've now actually seen the pound have net long positions. Now, some would probably point out that the reason for the pound moving into a net long position is that globally we know that the reflation trade is on. The US dollar is under real pressure, as it should be. We know also that global speculation around 2021 for the V-shaped recovery to happen is all a positive, remembering that the sterling is seen as a risk currency. All of that probably explains why the pound's net position is turned positive, and that is interesting in itself. That also shows very much so that this is a very idiosyncratic discussion that we're having. And I said that last time. This is not really against the US dollar, and I understand that, but I did want to show you this chart because it does show that the pound outside of this final hurdle that they're stumbling at is really being done in a cross rather than being done in the pair, and that other crosses for the sterling as well is actually under the same positioning. We're actually seeing pound go long, and you can see that happening across the board. But at this time, it's very interesting to see that that's still happening, considering that, as I said, the probabilities, according to even the politicians, is that they're going to actually have a hard landing. It's something to watch very closely. As you can see this chart on screen, it, being net long, the pound has been pretty short and sweet for pretty much most of this year. Once we started seeing COVID kick in, as you can see around March, the being long in the pound just certainly wasn't something you did. And then again, it was a very, very short period. You can see there with a pretty neutral position, really, if you look at what was going on at the end of August and through September. So just something to be aware of with your positioning, just something to be aware of with regards to the thought process. People have flipped very, very quickly in the last week, despite what we're discussing. But that doesn't mean that what we have been discussing has changed that much. So this is the outlook for euro sterling. I know it's not a great chart, and I do apologize for it, but that's unfortunately because the estimates between where it's going are incredibly wide. That is a gap that you just don't want to see any day of the week, but that's not the point. I needed to show you that there are some pretty wild expectations about where this is happening. You can see that yellow line. Somebody there is incredibly bearish on the outlook, particularly for the pound, and that what happens in Brexit is going to create an incredible headache at the start of next year, and we'll possibly see this pair ratcheting up from where it is now, possibly of much of 5p in a very, very short period of time. And then there's obviously somebody that's quite optimistic in the scenarios you can see on the orange line. What is more interesting to me is the estimate and the median estimate, is that you can see over that last period, as we've come towards, and I hope you can see my mouse, as we've sort of had that period of volatility, you can still see the overall view is that it'll actually still be a positive for the pound. And I find that interesting because, as we discussed last time, this downward trend channel was clearly because all of the language, all of the discussions was that although they were having some issues with fisheries and the level playing field rule and judicial oversight, it all looked pretty hunky-dory that they were going to get their finger out and actually do something. Now that we've got this movement here that we're not going to get a deal, it's all moving in the other direction. And that's sort of what I wanted to talk about, because the volatility that's going on up here has been pretty astounding in terms of exactly what it is. And looking at these candles and how strong they are. Now, I understand these are dailies, but I'll show you the 4-hour chart in a minute as well. It just again shows you very clearly that if you are looking to have a trade opportunity at Brexit free trade agreements, it's clearly in this pair only. And it is clearly heightened volatility. You can see that the moving average of the 7 days is very much in one direction, and it's starting to move the others that probably matter, being the 50 and the 21. The 21 is starting to come around, and it'll be interesting to see what happens if that cross happens. But this kind of movement in these candles here just show you how incredibly volatile this is, and why this week particularly, if you are going to try and have a look at it, to be aware that you can have, come on, sorry, apologies, go to markets, sorry, yeah, go to webinar. I was having fun here. Change. Because what you can see, the gapping issues here are very big. Now I understand this is a weekend movement, and that's all by the by, but that is a substantial drop in terms of what's here. Now that's obviously seen from a Brexit deal perspective as a positive, considering that they extended it over the weekend. But you can see how fast this ran up and how strong a channel from where we were originally with the idea that this was going to get done, and now that we're sort of pushing the boundaries that it might not, about how fast and how steady this has been, and to move through as much as almost 4 pence from top to bottom. There is opportunity there. There is certainly things to watch, but it is down on data, and so that therefore means that if you are looking at it in terms of what you want to do, I personally, and this is how I'm doing it, I'm watching the Dow Jones Newswires very closely. I'm watching your Reuters of this world very closely, BBCs of this world very closely, because they're actually at least giving you quotes of what's possibly been said behind closed doors, inverted commas, almost in real time. And that at least allows you to understand when a momentum change happens. When a momentum change happens, where's my mouse gone? Why it happens, and understanding that what exactly happened to cause this big, fast 4-hour movements almost consistently through. We know what happened here, as we saw. Basically the discussion on Friday night suggests that they're still going to and willing to make a deal over the weekend. We know why this gapping scenario happened, but as you can see, as we've gone along pretty much, and I've taken this around about an hour ago, that things are, again, they're trying to be in one direction at the moment, and that is probably the long euro pound position, which, as I said, is interesting considering that the pound against everything else is going the other way. What I'd also want to point out is that it's also very much idiosyncratic to just FX. So if I have a look here, this is actually the FTSE and the Stock 600, and I just wanted to show you very clearly there is a fairly minimal effect playing out on both in the last couple of days, in terms of where it is. I mean, some may argue that this obviously breakaway is reasonable with regards to what's happened to the FTSE, to the stocks. But again, if you're overall looking at this and the trend and how strong this has been, it's pretty much bang in line that they're working independent. It's not overly affected by the Brexit negotiations, because this dip here is actually at its end of November, start of December. Since then, it's actually only got stronger. Now, there may be an argument that that's because the currency has slightly weakened, but I would argue it's not. If you have a look at cable, that's basically working in almost a linear position of one direction, and that's up. If you have a look at also what's going on inside, euro dollar, same principle. It's not about that. So this, again, if you are looking at this and you want to trade what goes on in Brexit, it's not about what's going on in FX. It's clearly in this pair, in this cross and this cross alone, in terms of where we sit, and it's why the next sort of 72 hours to 5 to 7 days are going to make this trade incredibly interesting. I will highlight very clearly, it will be volatile and it will be risky, but certainly something I'm watching quite closely. I'm going to stop there because I don't think I want to actually go any further in terms of just me rambling on. I want to actually have a talk and a discussion with questions. So if you do have anything to talk about, please fire away in that question box now and we can go through them. So nobody's got any questions to sort of talk about at the moment? If you don't know how to, over on your GoToWebinar control panel, if you have a look over there on the right-hand side, it's all your drop-down boxes. The third from the bottom says questions. Just click on that little downward arrow and you can type in there and away you go. Well, if that's the case, there clearly isn't anything to come through from you guys anymore. I will actually close it there. Guys, thank you so much for listening to my webinars over the last 3 months, not just the Brexit ones, but also those of you that attended my presidential US debate ones and the US presidential elections. It's been an absolute blast. I do really much enjoy these. To all of you out there, please have a fantastic festive season. Have a happy new year. Let's hope 2021 is nothing like what we've experienced this year, and we can really have a good end to the year with a good trading year, and start 2021 with a bit of optimism that we can actually not only see the health issues through, but actually start getting quite excited by markets actually becoming a little bit not only more predictable, but actually being able to trade them in a way that becomes much more advantageous to all of us. So have a very good night. Thank you so much for listening, and good luck.